Former Vice President of Ecuador, Jorge Glass, denounced that he was mistreated and tortured by police officers who arrested him during the assault on the Mexican embassy in Quito last Friday. A UNICEF humanitarian aid convoy was hit by Israeli gunfire while on its way to northern Gaza to deliver life-saving supplies to children. And Friday marks 1 year since the beginning of the war in Sudan, which has left the country with millions displaced. Hello and welcome to From the South. My name is Belén de los Santos, and from the teleSUR studios in Havana, Cuba, we begin with the news. The former Vice President of Ecuador, Jorge Glass, denounced that he was mistreated and tortured by police officers who arrested him during the assault on the Mexican embassy in Quito on Friday. The former Vice President appeared on Thursday in the habeas corpus hearing via telematic from the maximum security prison La Roca. From there, Glass recounted what happened on Friday evening on April 5th when the police kidnapped him after breaking into the diplomatic headquarters, violating the Vienna Convention. Glass, who is currently on hunger strike, denounced the many blows he received, pointing out that his ribs were kicked and his thumbs were dislocated. At the hearing, defense attorney Andrés Villegas asked that the arrest be declared illegal and arbitrary and suggested as a measure of preparation that the detainee be transferred to a Mexican consular office or to the embassy of another country. And in this way, Jorge Glass told how he was beaten and tortured during his detention, where even he had a finger dislocated in an intentional way. Let's listen.
It was not enough for them to throw me against the wall. I hit my head against the wall, and then they started kicking me and kneeing me. I was kicked and kneed in the hips, especially on the right hip, to throw me to the floor. I tried to get away, as is natural, from this barbarity. Then they jumped at me, stepped on my neck, kicked me in the ribs, and one of these guys, masked in black, later told me that he was from there, so that you remember me, and dislocated my left thumb.
In this context, citizens demonstrated in front of the International Court of Justice building in Quito to demand freedom for former Vice President Jorge Glass. The demonstrators raised their voices to express their support for Glass and thanked Mexico for its actions of diplomatic protection. The demonstrators denounced the government for kidnapping, stressing that the accusations against Jorge Glass are false and represent an attack against the truth. In this regard, the United Nations addressed Mexico's request to expel Ecuador from the organization, a decision that lays on the member states' approval. The Secretary General of the organization, Antonio Guterres, urged to resolve the tensions between Ecuador and Mexico through dialogue, in addition to recalling the previous accusation issued by the United Nations regarding the flagrant violations of international law by the administration of Quito. In this context, Mexico demanded the prohibition of Ecuador as a member state of the United Nations, pending a public apology acknowledging violation to the fundamental principles and norms of international law. In this context, CELAC authorities announced that following a request from Mexico, the organization's virtual summit on violations of international conventions by Ecuador has been rescheduled for April 16th. Through a post on social network X, the president pro tempore of CELAC, Xiomara Castro, stated that as the president of the CELAC, she announced that at the request of Mexico, the extraordinary virtual summit of heads of state and government had been rescheduled for next Tuesday, April 16th at 9 a.m. Honduras time. This call is due to Ecuador's violation of the 1961 Vienna Convention and the 1954 Asylum Convention. In other news, also in Ecuador, a new violent incident left 3 dead and 2 wounded in the city of Guayaquil, showing that the security crisis persists today despite the military operation in the context of the internal armed conflict. Local media reported that gunmen arrived on motorcycles and opened fire indiscriminately in a park in the southwest of the coastal city, this being the latest in a series of armed attacks that have occurred since the beginning of this year. On January 9th, Ecuadorian President Daniel Noboa declared the existence of an armed conflict in the country that during Holy Week alone claimed the lives of 137 people. These crimes are taking place in the midst of the so-called Phoenix Plan, an initiative of President Noboa, which he promised would curb insecurity. The measure implies that the military must carry out controls in the streets and prisons despite the end of the 90-day state of emergency. And we go now to Venezuela, where authorities of the National Electoral Council and international observers have signed an agreement to accompany the presidential elections of 2024. During the meeting, the president of the National Electoral Council, Elvis Amoroso, transmitted to observers that the Venezuelan electoral system has given repeated signs of its strength and transparency. Likewise, the president of the Council of Electoral Experts of Latin America, Nicanor Moscoso, said that the work they will do will be strictly as observers and that the results of the work will be known by the Electoral Council. In this sense, Elvis Amoroso emphasized that the next election fulfills points of the Barbados Agreement, including the holding of elections in the second half of the year.
We hope that you will accompany us in all this trajectory here on July 28, and with all the objectivity to present your final report to the National Electoral Council, your suggestions that you may have in the course of this day or this electoral holiday.
Venezuela held the presentation hearing before the second Anti-Terrorism Control Tribunal to determine the crimes committed by former Executive Vice President of Venezuela, Tarek El Aissami. The Attorney General of Venezuela, Tarek William Saab, assured the hearing was held for the Public Prosecutor's Office to indict Tarek El Aissami and former officials Mark Lopez and Simon Serpa for the crimes of treason to the homeland, appropriation of public heritage, bragging, legitimization of capital, and association to offense. According to the statement, the detainees committed these crimes to execute an economic conspiracy to implode the economy through the destruction of the national currency and the astronomical rise of the US dollar. This criminal performance sought to generate violence and a financial economic chaos using the destruction of Venezuelan state-owned oil and natural gas company PDVSA public funds. And now let's take a short break, but remember you can join us on TikTok at teleSUR English, where you will find news in different formats, news updates, and much more. Other stories coming up. Stay with us. Welcome back to From the South. A UNICEF humanitarian aid convoy was hit by Israeli gunfire while on its way to northern Gaza to deliver life-saving supplies to children. The organization stated that the incident occurred on Wednesday near the military checkpoint in Wadi, Gaza, where the convoy was hit by 3 rounds of gunfire. After the incident, the aid workers decided that they wanted to continue with the mission, but it was impossible for them as the occupying army kept them waiting at a checkpoint for more than 2 hours. The convoy was part of a joint mission of UNICEF and the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees, carrying food, medicine, and fuel to feed the sanitation and running water systems in Jabalia in the north of the Strip.
I was in that car that was hit. It was waiting at a holding point just south of the Wadi Gaza checkpoint, where we are often instructed to wait before being called through the checkpoint. We were waiting there as instructed, and gunfire broke out in the vicinity. It seemed to be coming from the direction of the checkpoint towards civilians, who then turned and fled from the checkpoint. Luckily, myself and my colleagues, we were all safe, but this just underscores how dangerous it is for humanitarian aid workers in Gaza at the moment, that incidents like this continue to happen when they absolutely shouldn't.
In this context, UNICEF spokesperson Tess Ingram also noted that at least 23 Gazan children have died from malnutrition at the Kamal Adwan hospital, where the organization was heading to provide nutritional treatment.
It's tragic to see anybody suffering from malnutrition, which is such a painful condition, let alone in a place where malnutrition was almost non-existent before October. And it's now skyrocketed in the north of Gaza because of disruptions to food production, but also because of restrictions on aid access to that area. We've really struggled to get up there with aid. And as a result, we know that children are dying of malnutrition there. At least 23 children have reportedly died at the Kamal Adwan hospital, which is where we were trying to bring these nutrition treatments on Tuesday.
The Israeli army massacred at least 29 Palestinians after a bomb that targeted a house in the Gaza Strip. In addition to the fatalities, dozens of citizens were injured in the attack targeting a house belonging to the Tabatibi family located in the Darash neighborhood in Gaza City's downtown. According to the health ministry in Gaza, the Israeli occupation committed 8 massacres in the last 24 hours, claiming the lives of 89 people and injuring 120. Meanwhile, amid the siege, at least 31 Gazans have died from starvation, including 27 children suffering from malnutrition and dehydration, according to the UN, while at least half of the population of the Strip is at risk of imminent famine. Meanwhile, in the occupied West Bank, 2 Palestinians were killed and 3 were wounded by Israeli soldiers. The killings took place at dawn this Friday during an assault by the occupation army in Al-Farah refugee camp and Tubas town. The heavily armed Israeli soldiers stormed the city at dawn for 5 hours and deployed their forces in the streets and alleys. According to Wafa news agency, a Palestinian Red Crescent ambulance was also hit by Israeli fire, while one of its health workers was beaten and arrested by the soldiers. In parallel, there were night military incursions in Tulkarem, Salfit, Northwest Nablus, South Jenin, and West Hebron. In other news, members of the UN Security Council on Thursday failed to reach an agreement on Palestine's application for the full membership in the United Nations. Last week, the Palestinians relaunched their 2012 UN membership application. The Security Council launched its formal review process within an ad hoc committee of the Council made up of the same member states. At the end of a second closed-door meeting, Vanessa Ferracier, ambassador of Malta, who will chair the Council in April, said that 2/3 of Council members are in favor of full Palestinian membership. According to diplomatic sources, the vote could take place on April 18th at the initiative of Algeria.
And we sincerely hope, after 12 years since we changed our status to an observer state, that the Security Council will elevate itself to implementing the global consensus on the two-state solution by admitting the State of Palestine for full membership.
We now move on to other topics. In Kazakhstan, nearly 100,000 people have been evacuated from regions affected by the worst floods in 80 years to hit the nation. In this context, the Ministry for Emergency Situations detailed that more than a third of the evacuees are children. According to their statement, the state of emergency is maintained in 8 regions of the country, and 67 localities are still isolated due to the floods, which began at the end of March. On the other hand, the Ministry of Agriculture informed that more than 8,000 animals lost their lives in the region. Most of the country's livestock losses originated in the Oinsky district, where also about 340 homes were submerged underwater. Meanwhile, in Panama, a new wave of fires at a capital's main dump caused health issues to residents of the surrounding areas. The largest garbage dump in the Caribbean nation, known as Cerro Patacon, increased daily by 40% of solid waste from all over the country. Fires have become common in this area. In this context, medical personnel reported several cases of pulmonary diseases due to the gases emitted by the flames. Several Panamanian social organizations have complained to the government about the lack of response in this situation. And we have a final short break coming up, but before, we invite you to join our WhatsApp community for our English-speaking audience. You can scan the QR code on screen to join directly and also share the link to reach more people. Constant news coverage of Latin America and the Caribbean, as well as the rest of the world. Stay connected and informed with teleSUR. Final short break, don't go away. Welcome back to From the South. Friday marks 1 year after the so-called forgotten war in Sudan, which has left the country with millions displaced, infrastructure devastated, and a pressing risk of starvation. Sudan is in a catastrophic situation due to a dispute between generals, which for the past year has left, according to aid workers, thousands of victims of sexual and ethnic violence. Fighting began on April 15, 2023, between Army Chief Abdel Fattah al-Burhan and his one-time number 2, Mohamed Hamdan Daglo, leading the paramilitary rapid support forces, and experts see no end in sight to the conflict. The Northeast African country is experiencing one of the worst humanitarian disasters in recent history and the largest internal displacement crisis in the world, according to the United Nations. In this context, more than 10 million children have been affected by armed conflict, bombing, and various types of lethal violence in Sudan. Human rights organizations have noted that children in the country have witnessed or suffered devastating injuries, deaths, displacement, psychological damage, and destruction of their homes and communities. They also warn that millions of Sudanese children do not have adequate food and thousands are at risk of dying from disease. In this context, the World Health Organization reported that more than 3 million Sudanese children under 5 years of age suffer from acute malnutrition, and more than 710,000 children suffer from severe acute malnutrition.
We have a problem with children who have problems with growth and nutrition because they don't eat the right food for them. Most of the food consists of lentils, rice, and sometimes we make lentils with okra. Thank goodness there is now an organization that provides meals, probably composed of food supplements, to children under 5 years old.
After the fighting intensified inside the neighborhoods and innocent people died, there was a security breach and chaos issued among the prisoners. Thanks God we managed to get out after many difficulties. We were controlled by the Quake support forces. They harassed us and insulted us, but finally, we managed to reach the camp. At the beginning, everything was very good, but lately, it has become very hard, and the organizations are not present. There is a lack of food, and that causes malnutrition.
In other news, the president of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, assured that the joint space trip with Russia consolidates their relations. The head of state noted that the historic trip of cosmonaut Marina Basimskaya to the International Space Station was the beginning of a new level in the relations between Minsk and Moscow. He pointed out that the unfurling of the flags of Belarus and Russia, more than 400 kilometers above the surface of the planet, symbolizes the fraternal ties between the two people. The president, Lukashenko, also acknowledged the scientific personnel who planned and trained for the spaceflight. And let's go now to the world of sports. The FIFA and CONMEBOL have made the first date of the group stage of the 2030 World Cup official. This took place with the signing of the act of realization of the Centenary World Cup at the 78th CONMEBOL Ordinary Congress. The upcoming World Cup will have 3 matches in Uruguay, Argentina, and Paraguay, and the rest in Spain, Portugal, and Morocco, being the first soccer World Cup played between 3 different continents. At the event, the president of CONMEBOL, Alejandro Dominguez, the head of the FIFA, Gianni Infantine, Lacalle Pou, president of Uruguay, and Santiago Peña, president of Paraguay, were in charge of signing the intention for Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay to organize the first matches. The Italian Ministry of Culture announced the discovery in Pompeii of a black wall banquet hall decorated with scenes from the Greek mythology. Located in the region of Campania in southern Italy, this Roman city was buried under meters of ashes after a catastrophic eruption of Mount Vesuvius in the year 79 before Christ. The excavation works of the city started around 1748, and only about 45 hectares have been excavated. Nowadays, this site has become a popular tourist destination in Italy. Pompeii is also part of the Vesuvius National Park, declared World Heritage by UNESCO in the year 1997. And like this, we have come to the end of this news brief. You can find these and many other stories on our website at telesurenglish.net. And also join us on social media. We are on Facebook, X, Instagram, Telegram, and also on TikTok. For TeleSUR English, my name is Belén de los Santos. Thank you for watching.